1916. The Western Front is swallowed by trenches from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers die attacking the enemy's fortified positions, yet the front line barely moves. Machine gun bullets and endless fields of barbed wire form a deadly barrier the infantry cannot overcome. Grand artillery bombardments only warn the enemy in advance, and dense networks of wire obstacles often remain intact. Soldiers go over the top, only to find the wire uncut and are mercilessly mowed down by machine guns. Despair dominates the trenches, and a fundamentally new weapon is desperately needed. That weapon becomes the tank, an armored land warship capable of crawling through mud, breaking barbed wire obstacles, and taking machine gun fire. The British are the first to gamble on this revolutionary idea. Is there no alternative but to keep sending our armies to chew the barbed wire of Flanders, exclaims Winston Churchill, backing the bold Landship project? In this video, we will trace the tank's path from secret blueprints to battlefield triumph. We'll see how the appearance of tanks offered hope to break the trench deadlock, from the first tentative steps in 1916 through the painful lessons of 1917 to the mass breakthrough at Cambrai and the final strike in 1918. Part 1. Birth of the Monster, the Landship Project. Focus: technological necessity, secrecy, first models and trials. 1.1. The trench deadlock, the problem that had to be solved. World War I quickly drove armies into positional warfare. Barbed wire became a simple yet extraordinarily effective defensive device. Tangled obstacles tens of meters wide slowed infantry under fire. Soldiers tried night raids with bolt cutters, but during a major offensive it was impossible to get through the wire unnoticed. Machine guns, the reapers of modern war, wiped out whole companies in minutes once infantry became stuck in front of wire entanglements. The traditional reply, artillery, also had its flaws. Weeks of shelling, as before the Somme or at Verdun, plowed the ground and warned the Germans of an impending attack, but did not guarantee the destruction of the wire or all enemy machine gun nests. As British soldier Thomas Brown recalled, tanks did what artillery could not. Very often our attacks failed because the wire remained intact after the bombardment. But for the tanks, it was enough to come up, and they simply crushed the wire with their tracks. Thus the idea of an armored ram emerged, machines that would coldly crawl through bullets and shrapnel, crush barbed wire beneath them, and roll over trenches and fortifications. 1.2. Founding Fathers, Churchill and the Landship Committee. The idea of an armored vehicle was born in several minds at once. British officer and engineer Ernest Swinton had already proposed in 1914 the creation of a tracked armored tractor capable of carrying a gun and infantry. His idea met with skepticism from the military command. War Minister Lord Kitchener dismissed it as a fantasy. Fortunately, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, head of the Royal Navy, heard of the concept. Known for his unconventional thinking, Churchill understood that the war had reached a stalemate. In February 1915, on his own initiative, he created the secret Landships Committee under the Admiralty to develop armored vehicles. Moreover, Churchill dared to risk the Navy's budget. He effectively allocated £70,000, a colossal sum at the time, to support the project, even though formally it was for the Army's needs, not the fleet's. Thanks to this funding, engineers finally had the resources to experiment. Work was carried out under strict secrecy. To conceal the true purpose of the new machines, the British used a clever euphemism, calling them tanks, meaning water containers. The cover story claimed that these heavy metal vessels were intended for the Russian front to transport water across deserts, a tale so mundane that no one would suspect a new weapon. The term tank stuck and became the universal name for all vehicles of this type. Under this veil of secrecy, the project developed in the workshops of Foster & Company and Metropolitan. The first crude prototype, nicknamed Little Willie, appeared at the end of 1915. It had tracks, but could not cross wide trenches. Engineers William Tritton and Walter Wilson, who played key roles in the design, quickly improved it. The next prototype, Mother, received a distinctive rhomboid hull with tracks running all around it. This shape allowed it to cross trenches up to 3 meters wide. Although officially supervised by the Navy, the project was in fact built for the Army. Churchill later joked that the sailors gave birth to a monster for the soldiers. By the summer of 1916, the first combat-ready vehicles were finished. The Mark I, so the new tank was named, became the first production model. The British High Command ordered 150 of them without ever seeing them in action. The time had come to test these land battleships in war. 1.3. Mark I, the Blind Monster, on trial. The British first tank, the Mark I, looked both fearsome and fantastical. Its rhomboid hull, as tall as a man, was covered in steel armor plates up to 12 millimeters thick, enough to stop bullets and shrapnel, but not a direct shell hit. The front extended into 2 horns, between which sat the driver and commander. Inside was a 105-horsepower petrol engine that propelled the 28-ton machine at 5 to 6 kilometers per hour on firm ground. There was no suspension at all, so the ride was brutally rough. Steering required 4 men. One handled the main clutch, 2 operated separate gearboxes for each track, and another managed braking and turning. With no viewing turret, the crew was virtually blind. Vision was limited to narrow slits. Hence, the Mark I was jokingly called the Blind Monster. Its armament was housed in side sponsons. 2 versions existed. The male carried a pair of 57mm or 6-pounder naval guns and several machine guns, while the female was armed only with 4 or 5 machine guns, including 2 heavy 7.7mm weapons. The idea was that male tanks would suppress enemy guns and machine gun nests, while females would mow down infantry and gun crews. In practice, mixed groups of both types were often used together. The Mark I crew consisted of 8 men, and their working conditions were hellish. The engine, running in a sealed metal box, filled the interior with unbearable heat and carbon monoxide. Temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, while petrol fumes and exhaust caused dizziness. The roar of the engine and transmission was deafening. Tankers often suffered temporary or even permanent hearing loss. When hit, fragments of the inner armor flaked off as spall, tiny glowing shards of metal from bullet and shrapnel impacts. Crews wore masks and goggles, but these offered limited protection. Private Arthur Riffer, who fought in the first tank battle, recalled how, as their tank advanced through the village of Flers, German bullets made the inner armor glow white-hot, and burning flakes of metal showered down, scorching everything around. One of his crewmates was blinded by such splinters. Add to this the choking fumes from their own weapons. There was no ventilation for the powder gases from the guns and machine guns, and it becomes clear the tankers possessed extraordinary endurance. It is no wonder that early models lacked radios or signal lamps. Communication was nearly impossible, and leaving the tank under fire meant certain death. The crews joked grimly. Inside a tank, you have 3 enemies: the Germans, the heat, and our own engine. 1.4. Baptism by Fire, Flers, Courcelette, 1916. In the summer of 1916, the British High Command decided to test their new weapon during the Somme offensive. By then, the massive Allied attack on the Somme, which launched in July 1916, had stalled in blood with almost no territorial gain. General Haig agreed to throw several dozen of the mysterious machines into the next phase of the offensive. Early in the morning of September 15, 1916, during the Battle of Flers, Courcelette, tanks rolled towards the German positions for the first time. Of the 49 vehicles ready for battle, only 32 reached the starting line. The rest broke down or got stuck on the way. Even among those 32, several failed shortly after entering the battlefield. Across different sectors, infantrymen witnessed an incredible sight beside them: steel monsters crawling through shell holes and craters. It was a strange and eerie sight to see a dozen tanks climbing over every obstacle without stopping, recalled British soldier Sidney Taylor. At first, many were stunned, but they quickly recovered, thrilled that these machines were on our side, not the enemy's. The psychological effect on the Germans was devastating. Many German soldiers had never even heard of the possibility of armored tractors. When noisy iron boxes emerged from the dawn mist, unrelentingly advancing despite machine gun fire, defenders fled or surrendered in panic. A German memorandum of those days admitted that the enemy employed a new and terrifying weapon: mobile armored vehicles, against which we were at first powerless. In several villages along the front, the British achieved surprisingly easy victories. One tank under Lieutenant Ernest Swinton's command captured the village of Flers with supporting infantry. 3 tanks from different brigades broke through to the second trench line and helped seize the village of Courcelette. British newspapers raved. A single one of these miracle ships is ready to take on an entire battalion or battery and emerge victorious. Yet the first success was limited. Of the 32 tanks that began the attack, only a handful were still operational by the end of the day. The rest had stalled, fallen into craters, or were destroyed by direct artillery hits. As German panic was real, their defensive line did not collapse completely. General Haig had planned to unleash cavalry for the breakthrough, but the tanks moved too slowly, and the infantry couldn't keep up, still untrained to coordinate with armored vehicles. By the end of September 15th, the British had only advanced a few kilometers and captured several villages. Modest progress, yet notable compared to previous months. The press at home erupted with enthusiasm, hailing the dreadnoughts of the trenches as the miracle weapon that would finally turn the tide of war. Military analysts, however, saw the flaws. The Mark I was unreliable and crude, demanding improvements in both technology and tactics. Haig drew a mixed conclusion. The tanks should continue to be used, but only in small numbers and alongside infantry. The first battle became their baptism by fire. The tanks had proven their potential, yet also shown how far they still were from being a true wonder weapon. British soldiers from the 41st Division posed beside the knocked-out Mark I female tank D-17 after the Battle of Flers Courcelette, September 15, 1916. This tank was the first to enter the village of Flers, supporting the advance of the 122nd Infantry Brigade. Section 2. Lessons of Defeat. The Struggle for Doctrine, 1917. Focus: technical improvements, the tragedy of Bullecourt, and integrating the tank into Army doctrine. Subsection 2. Achilles' heel. Technical problems of the Mark I and II. The first combat experience showed that although the tank's concept worked psychologically, its mechanical reliability left much to be desired. Mark I tanks often broke down before even reaching battle. Engines overheated and stalled, gearboxes failed under strain. More powerful engines and better transmissions were urgently needed. It was no joke among crews that the tank's worst enemy is its own engine. The British hastily produced small batches of the Mark II and Mark III, but they differed little from the Mark I. In fact, the Mark II had been designed as a training vehicle with thinner armor to cut costs and was never meant for combat. However, due to a shortage of machines, some Mark IIs were sent into battle in early 1917, with tragic results. Their thin armor could be penetrated even by standard German 7.92mm K bullets, armor-piercing rounds with steel cores. German soldiers quickly realized they could disable tanks by firing these special bullets at close range, killing or wounding crews through the holes. Soon, Germany developed the first dedicated anti-tank weapon, the Tankgewehr M1918, a single-shot 13mm rifle capable of piercing 20 millimeters of armor, enough to penetrate any early tank at 100 meters. Speed and mobility were also major problems. The Mark I moved no faster than a walking man on firm ground, and just 1 to 2 kilometers per hour in mud or shell-pocked terrain. In autumn and winter, tanks often bogged down or slid helplessly into craters. The enemy quickly realized that deeper trenches or pit traps could immobilize them completely. Germans began widening trenches to 4 to 5 meters to prevent tanks from crossing. The British, in turn, invented a medieval solution, fascines, giant bundles of brushwood that tanks pushed ahead and dropped into wide ditches to form makeshift bridges. This method, tested later in 1917, worked fairly well. But the main lesson was clear: a tank alone was no panacea. Sent forward without support, it became a slow-moving target. Anti-tank artillery soon appeared. German 77mm field guns were used in direct fire against tanks. One well-placed shell could turn the 28-ton giant into a burning tomb. Reports from British tank crews in 1917 bluntly stated, "Our machines are immune to bullets, but helpless against guns." Despite this, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, did not abandon tanks. On the contrary, it prepared new operations to employ them. Even in their flawed state, tanks had proven they could break through defenses if fortune, mechanics, and tactics aligned. Subsection 2.2. The Tragedy of Bullecourt, April 1917. The Price of Imperfection. In the spring of 1917, the British prepared for new offensives. Particularly ambitious was Lieutenant General Hubert Gough, the commander of the Fifth Army, known for his aggressive style. He fanatically believed in tanks as a wonder weapon and wanted to deploy them as soon as possible. On April 11, 1917, during the fighting near the town of Bullecourt, France, Gough sent 12 tanks into attack alongside Australian infantry units. The plan was risky. Without proper artillery preparation, the tanks were to cut lanes through the German wire, and the infantry would then rush straight into the breach. Unfortunately, everything went wrong. The British Mark IIs, the very training tanks with thin armor, arrived late at the start positions, and some were already partially broken. When the Australians went over the top at dawn, many tanks were still crawling toward the front. As a result, the infantry advanced almost on their own. Only a few tanks reached the German trenches, and those quickly burst into flames after direct shell hits. The Australian infantry found themselves trapped, solid wire ahead, no artillery or tank cover, and machine guns scything them down. The losses were horrific. Of roughly 3,000 Australian soldiers who assaulted Bullecourt, 75% became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Over 1,000 men fell into German hands. Many suffered burns from enemy flamethrowers and grenades. Gough suffered a catastrophe. Of the 12 tanks, most were destroyed or abandoned by their crews. The Germans even captured several fully serviceable machines and staged a photo session with them before the second round of fighting, warhistoryonline.com. In the photos, German officers stand beside an abandoned Mark II with the inscription, "Lieutenant Clarkson," the very tank that failed to break the wire. The Australians were furious. They called the tanks miserable tin cans and blamed the British command for disregarding soldiers' lives. The first Bullecourt became synonymous with the mishandling of tanks. One participant wrote bitterly, "Our boys died because these slow iron monsters either arrived late or broke down. Without artillery support, a tank is just a target on tracks." 3 weeks later, in May 1917, the British and Australians repeated the attack on Bullecourt with larger forces, the Second Battle of Bullecourt. This time tanks were used scarcely. The emphasis shifted to artillery and massed infantry. The village was ultimately taken, but at the cost of over 7,000 casualties. For the history of tanks, Bullecourt's main lesson was obvious. Imperfect technology and faulty tactics can lead to disaster. Tanks cannot replace artillery. They require preparation, maintenance, and a reliable plan. After Bullecourt, the reputation of the miracle machines was badly shaken. Even some British generals began calling tanks an eccentric dead end. Yet the enthusiasts did not give up. They were already preparing a new generation of armored monsters. 2.3 Mark IV, Evolution and Standardization. Lessons were learned, and the British quickly refined their tanks. By May-June 1917, the new Mark IVs, designed in light of combat experience, began arriving at the front. The Mark IV became the first truly mass-produced British tank. 1,220 were ordered, and by the end of 1917, more than 1,000 had been built. This model formed the backbone of entire tank units. What did the engineers improve? First, protection was increased. The frontal armor remained 12 millimeters, but the side armor became thicker, up to 8 millimeters over a larger area. Crucially, armor now protected the Mark I's most vulnerable spot, the fuel tanks. Previously positioned in the front horns and easily penetrated, the fuel tank was moved to the rear, low in the hull, and shielded with armor plates. This reduced the risk of fires from hits. Fuel capacity grew to 70 gallons, extending range. To feed fuel to the now higher-mounted engine, an auto-vac pump was installed. Second, the armament sponsons were redesigned. On male Mark IVs, the 6-pounder guns received shorter barrels, shortened by about 1 meter, with little effect on real battlefield ballistics, but much less risk of digging the muzzle into the ground or snagging obstacles. The female Mark IVs had entirely new, shortened sponsons, about half the previous height, making crew evacuation through side hatches easier and improving the depression to fire down along the flanks. Both male and female sponsons now folded inward for rail transport. Previously, sponsons had to be unbolted, a lengthy and difficult process. The machine guns were also changed. Mark IVs received lighter Lewis guns instead of the older Hotchkiss and Vickers. In practice, the Lewis overheated and jammed frequently in tanks, and some vehicles were later refitted with Vickers guns. Finally, the Mark IV's mechanics were somewhat more reliable, though the upgraded transmission remained complex. Only on the Mark V was it simplified for a single driver. Even so, the Mark IV became a standardized tank. Over the summer of 1917, the British formed several Royal Tank Corps battalions, fully equipped with Mark IVs and trained to operate with infantry. Tank crews now had dedicated training grounds in England and France, where they practiced coordination with infantry units, obstacle crossing, camouflage, and night marches. Doctrine was evolving too. If in 1916 the tank was seen mainly as infantry support, by late 1917 the idea of a mass tank blow had taken shape. One of its leading theorists was Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, the Chief of Staff of the Tank Forces. As early as August 1917, he drafted a memorandum arguing that hundreds of tanks concentrated on a narrow front could rupture even the strongest position and restore maneuver to the battlefield. Though London received these ideas skeptically, tankers at the front believed Fuller. They needed only a chance to prove it, and that chance came in November 1917 at Cambrai. The French contribution. France was simultaneously developing its own tanks. The first French armored vehicles, the heavy Schneider CA-1 and Saint-Chamond, appeared in the spring of 1917. They had serious drawbacks, short tracks that left them stuck in trenches and unreliable engines, and performed modestly on the Chemin des Dames in April 1917. But the true triumph of French ingenuity was the light Renault FT-17. Engineer Renault created a wholly different concept, a small 7-ton, 2-man tank with a rotating turret on top, mounting either a machine gun or a 37mm gun. Engine in the rear and driver in front. This classic layout defined tank design for decades to come. The FT was slow, 7 kilometers per hour, and thinly armored, up to 22 millimeters, but it was cheap and could be built in large numbers. The French produced over 3,000 FTs by the end of the war, more than all British tanks combined. By the summer of 1918, the Renault FT formed the core of French tank units, and even entered service with the American Expeditionary Forces. But more on that in the final part. For now, let us return to late 1917 when the British Mark IVs were to face their greatest test. 2.4. The German reaction. Developing countermeasures. Initially stunned by the appearance of tanks, the German High Command implemented a range of countermeasures in 1917. Chief among them was the development of Germany's own armored vehicles. Enthusiasm and resources for tanks were limited in the Kaiser's army, but once the British Marks began sowing panic among infantry, the matter was put on a production footing. Sternparksagen A7V was designed. This Sternpanzerwagen, assault armored vehicle, was a true land ship, a 30-ton boxy behemoth that could carry 18 to 20 crew. For comparison, the British Mark IV had 8 crew, and the French FT had 2. The Germans envisioned many sub-gunners and machine gunners inside, firing through embrasures like a landing party. The A7V mounted a forward-facing 57mm gun, a captured Belgian piece, set into the hull front, and 6 machine guns around the perimeter. 2 Maybach engines drove it up to 12 to 15 kilometers per hour on roads, less off-road. But the A7V had one huge problem: mobility. Its hull was a large box on short tracks. It barely crossed trenches wider than 2 meters and often bogged down. Soldiers nicknamed it the walking house. Germany did not manage to build many tanks. Only 20 A7Vs were actually assembled and sent into battle in the spring of 1918. Instead, the Germans focused on countermeasures. The widespread use of steel-cored K-bullets and the Mauser Tankgewehr 13.2mm anti-tank rifle was introduced. These rifles could punch through the Mark IV's armor with a couple of shots at close range, and German Jägers learned to let a tank approach and then fire from cover. Artillery, however, became the chief tank killer. German 77mm and 105mm guns were ordered to engage tanks with direct fire, even if that meant shifting fire away from infantry targets. At company and battalion levels, anti-tank detachments were formed, equipped with guns, rifles, and even bundles of hand grenades for close combat. Troops received specific instructions: aim at the tracks, and if possible, throw grenades under the tank or into openings. Tellingly, the German A7V never became a decisive force. Its role was episodic. Where the Germans excelled was in learning how to fight British and French tanks. By late 1917 and early 1918, most Allied attacks with small numbers of tanks again sputtered out. Scattered platoons of armored vehicles were destroyed by artillery unless the assault achieved surprise. The Germans also fielded captured tanks. Several salvaged Mark IVs were repaired, painted with black crosses, and turned against their former owners. In April 1918, to their horror, the British encountered such Beutepanzer in the battle near Villers-Bretonneux, but that unique clash comes a bit later. For now, we shift to November 1917 and Cambrai, where Britain's tank forces would get their chance to redeem all earlier failures. Part 3. Blitzkrieg before Blitzkrieg, the miracle of Cambrai, November 1917. Focus, mass, coordinated use of tanks, perfect secrecy, breakthrough, and German counterattack. 3.1. The secret operation, rolling the planks. By late 1917, the Entente situation was dire. The French army was exhausted by Nivelle's failed offensive and plagued by mutinies, while Russia had dropped out of the war amid a revolution. After the bloody slaughter in the mud of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, summer-autumn 1917, Britain's Douglas Haig was under immense government pressure. He needed a victory, and fast. Tank enthusiasts offered a plan: strike a quiet sector of the front where the enemy expected nothing. Colonel J.F. Fuller and Brigadier General Hugh Ells, commander of the Tank Corps, selected the area near the town of Cambrai in northern France. The terrain there was flat, firm and scarcely cratered because it had seen little fighting, ideal for tanks. Two parallel canals, the San Quentin and the Nord, flanked the intended attack zone. Opposite lay a segment of the formidable Hindenburg Line, a three-tier German defense system with concrete bunkers, deep dugouts, and belts of barbed wire 50 yards, 45 meters, thick. Assaulting such a line seemed madness, but on this quiet front, the Germans had relaxed, thinking it unimportant. The Allies decided to exploit that complacency. The operation assembled 476 tanks, every available British machine. Of these, 378 were fighting Mark IVs, 216 males and 162 females, 32 were special wire-crushing tanks equipped with grapples, and the rest were supply, engineering, bridging, or medical vehicles. For the first time, the British had a true armored fist. General Els even created a symbol. Before battle, he rode atop his tank Hilda under the tank corps flag of 3 horizontal bands of brown, red, and green, symbolizing through mud and blood to the green fields beyond. That motto captured the spirit of the plan. Tanks would blaze a path from the blood-soaked trenches into open ground for maneuver. The idea was a sudden strike with no traditional preliminary bombardment. To preserve secrecy, the British took unprecedented precautions. Tanks were moved up only at night, hidden by day in woods and barns. They were painted in special camouflage and muffled with planks and tarpaulins so the clatter of tracks wouldn't alert German listeners. Tank crews were forbidden to write letters or discuss the operation. Even supporting infantry were kept in the dark about key details until the last moment. Instead of the usual week-long artillery preparation, the British adopted a new method, a brief hurricane bombardment lasting only minutes before the attack. Gunners had mastered map firing, using precise tables and intelligence reports to hit targets without ranging shots. This enabled a sudden, accurate storm of fire without betraying the plan. On November 20th, 1917, the plan was set in motion. At dawn, 6:20 a.m., November 20, 1917, Cambrai witnessed a scene the world had never seen before. 10 minutes earlier, more than 400 Mark IV tanks had rumbled their engines and begun crawling forward through the pre-dawn mist. Exactly 6:20, a sudden storm of fire erupted. Over 1,000 British guns simultaneously opened up on the German trenches. Within minutes, tons of steel and explosives rained down, tearing apart wire entanglements and machine gun nests. The whole enemy front flashed into pillars of colored fire, and then silence. It seemed too good to be true. We were moving forward, no shell holes, no enemy fire, recalled one frontline tanker. The tanks led the way. Behind them advanced tight formations of infantry, trained to keep safe intervals and follow through the gaps. The Germans, stunned by the sudden barrage, were confused. By all norms of trench warfare, after such shelling, there should have been a pause. But this time, when British guns abruptly fell silent, armored monsters emerged from the fog. For many German veterans, it was pure shock. We expected a rest when the British barrage stopped, and suddenly out of the mist came hundreds of dark, filthy beasts, an iron avalanche that refused to stop. Some fled in panic, others threw up their hands. Tank Commander Captain D.G. Brown reported, German outposts, stunned by the sudden rain of shells, were swept away in moments. Along the entire line, our tanks climbed over trenches into almost untouched rear ground. Defenders ran in panic, dropping rifles and helmets. Infantry scarcely had to fire. 100 Germans surrendered without resistance. In less than 4 hours, the British drove up 8 kilometers deep into the German line, capturing over 8,000 prisoners and about 100 guns. It was an unprecedented success in the static war. London rejoiced, church bells rang, newspapers proclaimed a magnificent victory at Cambrai. Haig and his staff saw a historic opportunity. Cavalry divisions were readied to exploit the breach and push into the enemy's rear. At last, it seemed, the long-awaited breakthrough had come. But amid the euphoria came problems in exploiting success. Even during the triumphant morning push, nearly half the tanks were already out of action. Many had been knocked out, especially near the village of Flisquières, where one surviving German battery destroyed over a dozen Mark IVs, while others had broken down or bogged down. roads clogged with abandoned machines which now blocked their own infantry's advance. By the end of November 20th, only about a third of the tanks remained operational. The rest burned or stood dead across the fields. There were too few engineers and tow vehicles to clear the way. The tanks themselves jammed the narrow routes. As a result, the British advance began to lose momentum by afternoon. The cavalry, meant to burst through the breach, arrived late. They couldn't find or build bridges over the canal, a task intended for the tanks, which were instead busy rescuing their stranded comrades. By evening, the British still hadn't seized key objectives, the Bourlon Ridge on the left, where Germans entrenched, nor the bridges over the San Quentin Canal on the right. One tank, Flying Fox 2, even tried to cross an intact bridge at Masnieri, but the span collapsed under its 28-ton weight, burying the vehicle in the canal. The delay let the Germans blow up other crossings. When the cavalry finally arrived at dusk, there was nowhere to cross. The horsemen stood helplessly before the canal as enemy artillery, now recovered, opened fire. Eventually, a few squadrons found a narrow dam and forced their way over, slashing at scattered foes with sabers. But it was an act of desperation, unsupported by infantry or tanks. The charge quickly faltered. Most troopers were killed or returned without their horses. Thus, Cambrai' first day was both a dazzling success and a missed opportunity. The tanks had achieved the breakthrough, but the British failed to hold or expand it. That evening, Haig reported a victory, yet the Germans were far from beaten. Army Group Commander Crown Prince Rupprecht wrote in his diary that the day proved a new menace, a massed tank assault that demands a swift answer. And the Germans soon found one. Within days, they gathered forces for a counterattack. 3.3. The German counterattack. Elasticity versus steel. The German High Command, initially shocked by the scale of the breakthrough, quickly regained control. General Ludendorff even briefly considered a strategic withdrawal, but on the spot the Corps commander, General von Marwitz, assured him the front could be restored. By 1917, the Germans had adopted elastic defense in depth. Minimal forces in the forward line, with main reserves held back and ready to counterattack. Cambrai became a showcase of this doctrine. The British broke through the first and second lines, but failed to cross the third, the Bourlon Wood line. The Germans immediately brought up fresh storm troop divisions, up to 20 divisions over the week. On November 30th, 1917, just as the British were flagging and no longer expecting action from a beaten enemy, German assault groups launched a massive counteroffensive. They struck the flanks of the salient created by the tanks and rapidly clawed their way back almost to the British start lines. British losses were now enormous. The counterblow caught them off guard, and many units were surrounded and smashed. For the first time, the Germans used infiltration tactics on a large scale. Small storm troop detachments bypassed strongpoints, slipped into the rear, and disrupted command and control. Only then did main forces arrive to clean up isolated defenders. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had been refining these methods since the summer after Verdun, and now they paid off. The Cambrai salient was eliminated, and the British fell back nearly to their original positions. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, about 45,000 British and 50,000 German. Thus ended the 11-day drama that first brought the British applause and then crushing criticism. For the history of the tank, Cambrai left two important legacies. First, tactical lessons. It became clear that a tank can break a defense but cannot hold it. Without infantry, artillery, and reserves, any breakthrough can be sealed by a counterstroke, as the Germans demonstrated. Haig admitted in his report, tanks have shown high effectiveness against fortifications, but they cannot act alone. Second, a moral and doctrinal legacy. Cambrai convinced even skeptics that tanks were not a fad, but a real force. If in September 1916 some called them an interesting toy, after November 1917 the armies of the world understood the era of mechanization had begun. No wonder the historian Basil Littlehart wrote that November 20, 1917, though ending in failure, was a milestone of the military art, the herald of a new age. The British Tank Corps earned heroic renown. Its commander, Els, was knighted, and its chief of staff, Fuller, developed the breakthrough theory into his famous Plan 1919, a purely tank-led offensive for 1919, ultimately unnecessary because the war ended. Yet alongside admiration, Cambrai sparked resistance among traditionalists in the high command. Many infantry generals resented tankers for claiming the laurels of the breakthrough, believing resources had been wrongly diverted from infantry and guns. Quiet debates began: tankers versus traditionalists. Some argued that future offensives belonged to hundreds of tanks with minimal manpower. Others insisted infantry's role was eternal and tanks merely auxiliary. The argument continued after the war. On the battlefield, however, the dilemma resolved itself. In 1918, everyone saw that only the combined, synchronized use of all arms, tanks, artillery, infantry, and aviation, could finally break the enemy's resistance. German heavy tank A7V Mephisto, the only one preserved today, photographed at the Australian War Memorial. These machines first saw combat in the spring of 1918 as Germany's answer to the British Mark IV. Only 20 were produced, and they played no decisive role. 3.4. Moral and Doctrinal Aftermath. The Battle of Cambrai entered history as the first large-scale tank attack. It did not produce a strategic victory, but it changed minds. Afterwards, the Allies resolved to expand tank production. Despite losing most of their machines at Cambrai, the British ordered new Mark V's and light tanks and even launched projects for super-heavy vehicles like Flying Elephant. The French ramped up Renault FT production, their industry working at full tilt and delivering up to 200 tanks per month by autumn 1918. In Germany, the moral effect was strong as well. Ludendorff wrote that after Cambrai, he ordered anti-tank detachments formed across the front and artillery liberally committed to destroying the English tractors. In the staff colleges, both Allied and German, the battle's lessons were analyzed and the conclusion drawn: offensives had to be launched with surprise and mobility, avoiding months-long preliminary bombardments. That idea would underpin operational concepts in the Second World War. For ordinary soldiers on both sides from 1917 onward, tanks ceased to be a curiosity. Once seen as something out of H.G. Wells, who, indeed, had written the pre-war story The Land Ironclads, a near prophecy of the tank, they became familiar companions or foes. Allied infantry manuals of 1918 already included sections on how to operate with tanks. Keep about 50 yards behind, use the hull for cover from shell bursts, but don't bunch up lest one shell take out the whole group. Troops were also warned not to panic if a tank was knocked out. The objective had to be seized even without the armored friend. But German soldiers, by contrast, drilled on how to kill a tank, aim at vision slits, strike from the flanks, and throw bundled grenades under the tracks. By late 1917, the tank had shed its aura as a psychological superweapon and become simply a very powerful, increasingly routine instrument of war. So it often goes. A new weapon shocks by breaking conventions, then countermeasures and techniques emerge, and it becomes normal. Yet one more great role still awaited the tank in the final operations of 1918, when they would help deliver the decisive blow to the German army. 4. The Steel Fist, The Final Blow and Legacy, 1918. A repelling the German spring offensive, Operation Michael. At the beginning of 1918, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. Russia had exited the war, allowing Germany to transfer an additional 50 divisions to the Western Front. Ludendorff decided to deliver a series of decisive risk blows in the spring before the United States could send its forces in large numbers. Thus began the 1918 Spring Offensive, a succession of German attacks. The most powerful, Operation Michael, March 1918, shattered the British front in Picardy. On March 21st, German stormtrooper units, advancing under cover of fog, broke through the positions of the British Fifth Army and surged westward. The Kaiser's forces retook in days what they had failed to capture in years. It seemed only a matter of time before they reached the vital junction at Amiens, splitting the British and French armies apart. In this crisis, the British used their tanks as fire brigades, rushing them to the most threatened sectors to stem the onslaught. Unfortunately, by March 1918, they had few operational tanks left. Many had been lost at Cambrai. Still, isolated Mark IVs and light tanks, including French Renault FTs of the newly arrived American Expeditionary Force, fought delaying actions to slow the Germans. On March 24, 1918, near the town of Villers-Bretonneux, history witnessed the first ever tank versus tank battle. 3 German A7Vs, one of them the famous Nix, advanced with infantry, and 3 British Mark IVs, 2 females armed only with machine guns, and 1 male with cannons. A firefight erupted. The German tanks opened up with their 57mm gun and machine guns, wounding several members of the British female crews who could do nothing with their machine guns and were forced to retreat. Then the male Mark IV, commanded by Lieutenant Frank Mitchell, entered the fight. His tank closed in and fired several rounds from its 6-pounder guns, knocking out the lead German A7V Nix, which began to smoke and halted as its crew abandoned it. The other 2 German tanks, unwilling to risk destruction, withdrew. British reinforcements, 7 light Whippet tanks, then pursued them, but German artillery appeared and destroyed several of the Whippets. Mitchell's Mark IV tank was also hit and had to withdraw. The battle ended without a clear victor, but the British were satisfied. We have shown the Germans their tanks aren't so terrifying. Tank fighting tank, now that too had become reality. In total, 3 German and 8 British tanks clashed at Villers-Bretonneux. 1 A7V and several Allied light tanks were destroyed, the rest dispersed. The skirmish was minor in the campaign's grand scale, but entered history as the world's first tank duel. The German spring offensive, despite its dramatic opening, burned out by July 1918. Germany had exhausted its reserves and lost its best storm units. The Allies held firm, thanks in part to flexible defense and the quick reaction provided by tanks. At that turning point, the initiative passed to the Entente, and the tanks would play a decisive role in the final victorious offensives. 4.2. Amiens, August 1918, the Black Day of the German Army. After halting the spring onslaught, the Allies, now under the unified command of Marshal Foch, launched their strategic counteroffensive, known as the 100 Days Offensive, the final phase of the war. It began with the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918, an operation remembered as the day something finally broke in the morale of the German army. Erich Ludendorff himself called it the Black Day of the German Army. Tanks were the defining component of this victory. The Allies planned the offensive with utmost secrecy, much like Cambrai, but now they possessed far greater resources and experience. British, Canadian, and Australian Corps attacked in coordination, supported on the flank by the French First Army. The main strike force consisted of about 530 British Mark V and Medium A Whippet tanks, along with roughly 70 French tanks, light Renault FTs, the greatest concentration of armor in the entire war. The tanks advanced shoulder to shoulder with infantry under the cover of a creeping barrage, a dense curtain of artillery fire moving forward meter by meter ahead of the troops. Overhead, hundreds of British and French aircraft bombed and strafed German positions, suppressing enemy planes. Amiens became the first true example of a combined arms operation where infantry, tanks, artillery, aviation, and even cavalry reserves all acted in concert. At dawn on August 8, 1918, the Germans were taken completely by surprise. Fog and the sudden unannounced attack ensured total tactical shock. The new Mark V tanks, with improved engines and simplified controls, climbed easily over debris and craters. They carried infantry close behind them, soldiers sheltered behind the hulls until they reached the trenches, then rushed forward under the covering fire of tank-mounted machine guns. German defenders surrendered en masse. The Australian and Canadian Corps, considered elite shock formations of the Entente, performed especially well, attacking the junction between British and French sectors. In less than 24 hours, the Allies broke through to a depth of up to 12 kilometers, an almost unimaginable gain after years of trench stalemate. German reports describe scenes of entire groups of prisoners emerging with hands raised, staring in astonishment at the advancing tanks. One German officer wrote, "Our men are utterly demoralized. They say it's impossible to fight against these tanks, they are everywhere." By evening, August 8th, the German army was morally shattered. Ludendorff noted that for the first time he saw whole units surrender without a fight and realized the war was lost. It was then that he uttered his famous phrase about the Black Day. Of course, tanks alone did not win the battle, but without them, victory would have been impossible. Amiens operation vividly demonstrated how much tank warfare had evolved in a single year. From dozens of machines to hundreds, from improvisation to coordination. The battle also revealed Germany's weakness. They lacked both tanks and effective means to counter such massed armor. A few German guns managed to destroy several dozen tanks, but the advance never stalled. One machine broke down, another took its place. This time, the infantry kept pace and secured the captured ground. Within days, the German front was rolling backwards, and the Allies began a broad offensive along the entire Western Front. 4.3. The Technological Race and What Came Next. The war's final months turned into a true race of tanks. Britain and France sought to exploit their industrial edge and overwhelm the enemy with steel. Alongside the heavy Mark V, the British fielded the medium Mark A Whippet. Small, fast, 13 km/h machine gun tanks intended to burst into the rear and pursue a retreating foe. In August-September 1918, Whippets conducted raids tens of kilometers deep into German positions, sowing panic among supply trains and staff units. The French, meanwhile, produced an improved version of their little one, the Renault FT Model 1918 with the SA-18 37mm gun. These tanks formed the backbone of the first American armored units. The United States did not manage to field original domestic designs before the war's end, though there were joint efforts with the British on the heavy Mark VIII Liberty. So the American Expeditionary Forces used French-built Renault FTs and in part British Mark V. Under the young Colonel Patton, the Americans formed two tank brigades. First employed in September 1918 at the Battle of Saint-Michel, together with the French, about 140 Renault FTs under the U.S. flag attacked the fortified salient and helped eliminate it. Later, American tankers fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Though inexperienced, they learned fast. Future luminaries Patton and Eisenhower began mastering armored warfare then and there. Numerically, the Allies outstripped Germany in tanks by orders of magnitude. By autumn 1918, they had roughly 3,000 operational machines at the front, mostly light FTs and medium Mark V, whereas Germany had no more than 100, including captured vehicles. The last German attempt to use tanks came in October 1918 on the defensive, when a few A7Vs and captured Mark IVs were thrown against the British in Belgium. But it no longer mattered. The German army was in retreat across the board. The Entente's 100 days, from August to November 1918, were filled with tank attacks at Amiens, along the Somme, in the Second Battle of Cambrai 1918, during the breach of the Hindenburg Line at the St. Quentin Canal in September, where the Mark V nicknamed Deborah distinguished itself, and in the fighting in Champagne and Flanders. Tanks became an inseparable part of the Allies' victorious advance. Germans noted bitterly, "Every morning dozens of those contraptions crawl at us and there is nothing we can do." By the armistice of November 11, 1918, military experts were already debating the tank's future. Some Britons, exemplar General J. Estienne, British figure, proposed disbanding the Tank Corps as having completed its task and being no longer needed, arguing future wars wouldn't be so positional. Others, like Colonel Fuller and Captain Liddell Hart, urged further mechanization. One thing was obvious: the tank had broken the deadlock. Without it, the war might have dragged on much longer. A French light Renault FT crossing a trench, Saint-Mihiel, France, 1918. The first tank with the now classic layout, turret on top, engine at the rear, driver in front. Over 3,000 were built by war's end, used by the French, Americans, and Italians. 4.4 Conclusions, Legacy and Doctrine. The First World War gave birth to a new arm, the armored forces. From the arrival of the lumbering Mark I in 1916 to the massed operations of 1918, tanks underwent a dramatic evolution in both engineering and tactics. They literally restored maneuver to the battlefield, serving as the antidote to trench stalemate. Of course, tanks alone didn't achieve this. The decisive factor was the combined action of tanks with infantry, artillery, and aviation. But tanks made it possible to crack fortifications that had previously been impregnable without catastrophic losses. The price of innovation was high. The British Tank Corps alone lost over 500 officers and 3,000 other ranks killed, with many more wounded. Tankers died not only from enemy fire, but from heat, choking fumes inside the hull, and mechanical accidents. Service was perilous. Their contribution, however, is indisputable. As General Ludendorff admitted in defeat, we lost the war because we failed to arm ourselves with tanks in time. The Great War's legacy for armored development was immense. Immediately after the war, theoretical inquiry surged. Britain's J.F. Fuller and B.H. Little Hart, France's Charles de Gaulle, and Germany's Heinz Guderian all studied the 1916-18 experience closely. They concluded that in a future conflict, the tank must become the main striking arm. Fuller and Little Hart advocated independent armored formations, tanks concentrated rather than scattered in penny packets supporting infantry, designed to rupture the front and exploit in depth, what Fuller called the strategic exploitation of the breakthrough. Guderian, building on their work, set out the concept of blitzkrieg in Achtung Panzer, 1937, lightning war, with massed armored wedges supported by aviation, breaking defenses and encircling enemy armies. In essence, this was the refinement of ideas witnessed at Cambrai and Amiens. In the Second World War, German panzer divisions applied these principles with stunning effect against France and Britain in 1940. The irony, the very victors who first built tanks drastically cut their armored forces after the First World War. Britain even mothballed many vehicles and disbanded units, while Germany, in secret, developed new tanks and tactics based on the lessons of failure, results that told in 1939-41. Ultimately, the tank became king of the battlefield for decades, and that ascent began in 1916-18. Modern tanks are incomparably more advanced, yet their essence is unchanged: protection, firepower, and mobility for breakthrough. As Little Hart wrote, the tank restored to the soldier the power to maneuver on the battlefield without being annihilated in a second by machine gun fire. It returned depth and space to strategy where the earthworks of trenches had swallowed them. Thus, the story of the First World War's tanks is the story of how engineering ingenuity and human courage broke an apparently immovable deadlock. The steel ram hacked a path out of the trench inferno, a path that ultimately led to the end of the Great War.